Beyond the Headlines is the intellectual property of the Verizon Media Group. Copyright 2021.
Alive, still connected, still with you.
Coming up tonight on Beyond the Headlines, the rumor mill in overdrive today as social media went wild with reports that Sam Bankman-Fried was rushed to a local hospital. According to official reports reaching Eyewitness News and Beyond the Headlines, those reports are false. SBF was not taken to hospital at any time today, and this evening remains at the Bahamas Department of Correctional Services. So that brings you up to date on what's happening in terms of SBF and the case. Meanwhile, there have been a number of damning news articles from major U.S. publications since the FTX collapse. The reports suggest that Bahamian officials are questionable. The congressional hearing in Delaware also accused Bahamian officials, namely the Prime Minister and the Attorney General, of stonewalling in its push to have the Bahamas embrace the U.S. legal system as the primary venue for solving the collapsed crypto exchange. This pushed Foreign Affairs Minister Fred Mitchell to speak out in defense of the Bahamas and its systems. Well, tonight, Minister Mitchell, in a one-hour special here on Beyond the Headlines, addresses FTX, the fallout for the country, and the international media glare directed on the Bahamas. Minister Mitchell begins this first segment talking about what the vision of the Davis administration is to diversify the economy and move the country forward. He also talks about what sometimes is a double standard as the Bahamas' financial services industry, while heavily regulated, is still being pressed to do more. Minister Mitchell, thank you for this interview and for this special edition of Beyond the Headlines. We just want to kind of start from the beginning and work our way through. And so we want to start with the vision of the Davis administration to expand and diversify the economy, to become sort of a leader in the crypto space here in the region and expand the financial services industry and offerings. What does that look like? And then we will work our way into FTX. But what does that look like for the country to need to do that, and the Prime Minister's willingness to obviously embrace something that is still relatively new?
Well, notwithstanding the FTX matter, the forward trajectory of financial services, of the digitalization, of all of the new products in the financial services sector, I think those are all going forward. And people generally see the country as a safe place to invest, a good place to come, and the government is continuing with its programs. You can get distracted in these various goings on now in the public domain, but I think generally things will move forward. This too shall pass, and we're confident that at the end of the day people will be satisfied that this is a great place to be.
Let's talk about this new legislation that's just added to all the other legislation that exists already in the space, in the financial services industry, the DARE Act, that is specifically targeted towards sort of, I guess, the crypto type businesses. Let's talk about what that's intended to do, the kind of teeth it has to ensure that it properly polices this still new industry.
Well, I won't pretend to be an expert on any of this, but there is this thing called cryptocurrency, and I have a very wealthy friend that I just had breakfast with a couple of days ago who's an American, and he said, look, I don't understand it, I'm not getting in it, and I like to buy a car, or I like to buy land, and I like to have my cash in the bank. I don't understand this, right? But there are some people who understand it, and it's been madly successful for many people around the world. So it's a new product. And the Bahamas would have made a mistake if it had not embraced this new product. We need to get our share of the pie. We were pioneers in the legislation. And as I've said in some of the justifications that I've espoused publicly, sometimes these things work and sometimes they don't. But what you have to do is you always have to be on the cutting edge if you can be. And we set out to do that as a government, to say, look, and the previous administration, we want to have a smart city, we want to have green cities, we want to digitize, we want to be on the cutting edge of all of these things. So we entered the space, we passed the legislation. The legislation was thought to be cutting edge and has worked. It attracted people and entities to come to the Bahamas. And unfortunately, there was a failure with this one. It's a large failure, but businesses fail. As a matter of fact, I think when you go and look at the history of businesses, they tell you that in the first year, you have a high rate of failure of businesses. So in a sense, it's not a surprise that there was a failure. But the failure does not cast any negative on the Bahamas. It's just a business failure.
It's a huge business failure that I guess is reverberating around the world. I want to ask you, Minister, do you think the DARE Act is as strong as it needs to be or could have been in hindsight?
Well, look, this is a new product, as I said. Obviously our experts are looking at it to see whether or not there needs to be any changes in the regulations or the act. But at the time the act was passed, it was believed to be cutting edge. It put in place all of the regulations, rules, laws that were necessary. You can't legislate morality and you can't stop crookedness. There are going to be dishonest actors, any system that you put in place. If you go back to the history of America, the Securities Commission, which now exists, was put in place in the 1930s by FDR, who was then the president. He put the man, Joe Kennedy, who is the father of John Kennedy, the president, to become the first chair of the Securities Commission. And he did that because this man had come from a background of manipulating stocks during the Wall Street era in the 1920s. And he put the fox in charge of the hen house, so to speak. And he reformed the system. So they put in place reforms. But guess what? Decades later, Mike Millikan went and bilked investors of billions of dollars. How do you stop it? In the United States, you had Enron, you had Charles Keating, you had Bernie Madoff. In a supposedly sophisticated first world country, they couldn't stop it. But America survived. They made various changes to the laws. And well, here we are today in the Bahamas. So we learned what lessons, Sir Franklin Wilson was saying in a public comment the other day, that obviously you have to learn lessons from what happened. But the jurisdiction is fine. The people are fine, of the Bahamas are fine. And I think that leaders overseas, particularly in the United States jurisdiction, ought to be really careful about the language they use with regard to the Bahamas. And here's why. The United States is the most powerful country in the world. It is at the apex of power. We happen to sit 50 miles next to them, away from them at the closest point. And we are allies, not foes of them. We cooperate on all kinds of levels. You have 6 million US tourists, give or take, coming to the Bahamas every year. They have a wonderful vacation. They engage in the country. They help us in many, many ways. During the hurricane, when there was the damage, people came to the rescue without the official government sanction of the US. So we're very close. So when a US legislator, and you know, I compare this, we call it the Pax Americana, this era, similar to the Pax Romana. So Rome was at the center of the world. And what Rome did affected the world. So what Americans do, that affects the world. When you have American legislators getting up in a public testimony, or American public officials, and I make the distinction between them and the government, because the government of the United States is not engaged in this. We have great relations with them. But individuals from various other branches and statutory bodies in the United States making these comments, which appear on the face of it to be injudicious. And you know that you can say words in America can destroy countries. Yes. So I think you just have to be, I'm just appealing to them publicly. Look, let's lower the temperature on this. You know, it is a business failure. We agree with you. It has been a large business failure. We agree with you. But the question is, how do we get to who do we punish And do we get compensation for the people who lost their money? That's the issue. And the properties which they say have been bought in the hundreds of millions in the Bahamas, according to the private international law rules of the United States, and I think this is in the state of Delaware as well, the lex situs, which is where the land is located, the law of the land which is located, actually controls what happens to those assets. So there needs to be cooperation, even if the bankruptcy proceedings go forward for FTX in the United States. You still need the cooperation of this jurisdiction if you're going to grab back those assets. So what's the point of finger wagging at this point? Well, why don't we just cooperate? And again, Sir Franklin...
Giving the impression that you said, because they are strong-arming based on some language coming out of that hearing. For example, our Prime Minister and Attorney General were almost rigged over the coals and had, like you say, had that finger pointed directly at them.
Yes, and of course all of them are just acting in their roles, qua Prime Minister, qua Attorney General. And there's this evidence, I thought it was offensive to say that we don't trust the Bahamas government. Where do you get that from? Where do you get it from? Where's the evidence that you have to mistrust the Bahamas government? At every level, the Bahamas government has cooperated, does cooperate with their law enforcement bodies, with their courts, with the official U.S. government at the executive level. So there's no evidence to suggest that otherwise. And they've been trying to hang their hat on this email, they said, that was sent to one of our public officials. I'm advised, I haven't forensically gone through this myself, but I'm advised that when you look at the timeline, what they suggest is simply not correct. So, just before the interview, I was coming here and reading something about the crash landing which took place with United Airlines on the Hudson. And when I saw the movie, what it said was that when they were doing the investigations, they at first said that the captain had made a mistake because he could have made it back to the airport. When they actually went through the timelines, they said, look, you have to look at the facts. And the facts show that it takes a while for someone to react. So when he discovered what the issue was, he made the correct decision. So what I'm saying is, while you're making all these allegations, you have to be careful what you allege, because my advice is that when you go forensically through this, what they allege will not come out to be correct. The problem is the damage is done by the words you say.
I wanted to ask you about the damage, and we'll get to that a little bit later, but let's just right now then, and just for a moment, talk about that damage. The damage that you've been fighting to repair and respond to at every turn against the international media, and many articles that have come out. You've spoken with Bloomberg, etc., to really ensure that, wait a minute, let's not run away with this narrative. How damaging is it for that Delaware hearing to be told, just as you said, oh, basically we don't trust the Bahamas government. The Prime Minister, questionable. The Attorney General, questionable. How damaging is that?
Well, thankfully the judge in the hearing himself said, look, I'm not going with this. You, the parties, have to find a way to wade through this. So that gives us hope that it's going forward. But, when this issue came up where the Bloomberg article says the Bahamas, well, we shouldn't have been surprised because we had piracy and rum running and this and that and all the rest of it. So a historian was speaking to me and said, look, this is incredible. You have a country that was settled by European settlers who came to the United States, took land away from the people who were there, herded them into reservations, locked them up, discriminated against them, to create what they said was a republic where all men were created equal. But then, after having taken the land, what did they do? They brought in millions of African slaves who had to work for free for 200 years. Then they freed them, and after that murdered them in large numbers because they wanted to fight for rights, because they were still not equal. And the discrimination exists today. Now, do we want to go down that road about arguing about who has the moral right to do what? It isn't useful in solving today's problem. That is, those who need to be punished for their misdeeds with FTX need to be punished, and those who are due compensation should get compensation. The arguments about our history and all the rest of that, not relevant to the debate at this point. So in terms of the reputation of the country, though, what we know is the history of all of these things. It turns out that the damage is not lasting because there is this impact at first. But once we push back, and I've said to you in the pre-chat that I understand nature abhors a vacuum. And we have a responsibility. My advice to the Prime Minister was we have a responsibility to shape this conversation and to not allow it to be a one-sided conversation. You have our friends from the opposition jumping into the bandwagon. You have who I call the Bobsy twits out there every day, stirring up trouble. And it always turns out that what they say is false. But people, when they don't hear an answer from the other side, tend to embrace the language of the first person who's out there. So I try not to get into a polemic with individuals over this and stick largely with the principles of this. We have a good jurisdiction, we have a good court system, we have good police officers, we have a good investigative system. We tried to put in place a good regime with our Securities Commission. Our officials are officials of integrity. Prime Minister is a good Prime Minister. The Attorney General knows what he's doing. And at the end of the day, I'm satisfied, in cooperation with the other jurisdictions, this matter will be resolved and the reputation of the country will be intact. There's another reason I want to be sure reputation is intact. A young man just came back from university a couple of days ago. Speaking to him, he is engaged with a group of 27 or so youngsters in the UK where he goes to school. And he told me, but for 4 of them, none of them have any interest in coming back to the Bahamas. So we face this brain drain. Now, there's some structural issues with this because the country is small and you can't, if you want to be a rocket scientist, there's no place to work as a rocket scientist, okay? So let's acknowledge that. But what I find is really interesting is even though people move away from the country, they want to still be associated with the Bahamas. They have an interest in, and we have an interest in reputation because when they go and present their Bahamian passport, we don't want people saying, oh, you come from that corrupt country. We can't afford for that to be. So we have to fight to make sure that on all levels, what I call the aha moment. When I cross the border into New York, for example, I meet the customs officer and he asked me, I just had a tired trip, and he says, he sees my passport. He says, why is your face made up? You're going to paradise. And that's what people think of this country. And so I want it to continue to be when people hear Commonwealth of the Bahamas, they say, aha, that's the place I want to go to. And we're going to fight to maintain that.
Minister, should the Prime Minister make an address on this matter? Many people feel as though he's been quiet. They applaud you for speaking out and defending our nation, but they're asking, where's the Prime Minister?
Well, the Prime Minister, remember, made the first statement on this matter when there was an attack on the regulators. So he did a communication to Parliament. And essentially what I try to do is follow that line. I try not to go beyond those parameters. Because what he advised us all is that because this is a judicial process, and you know that I'm also the minister responsible for extradition, that we ought to be, again, judicious in what we say. So that's why we're trying to first privately lower the temperature on this, but secondly, to say, when we speak, to speak as judiciously as we can. He did, in fact, address the matter with the press a couple of days ago, saying that the criticism of the regulators, in his view, was ridiculous. And so I hide behind that as well.
Minister, you spoke about fighting for the reputational damage and to keep it intact for the Bahamas. We have also had to fight with our financial services sector, which has shrunken a lot over the years. We have put in a whole lot of regulations, etc., but always it appears to want to push further. Do you feel the Bahamas is measured in the same way as, say, for example, a Delaware that has the same financial services product or offer the same financial services product that we do?
My friends tell me that if you want to open a bank account in the US, it takes you about 20 minutes. Over here, it takes 6 months. It's ridiculous. all because of some crusade by the OECD, which is the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. This is a group of developed countries, and they arrogate to themselves to impose rules on the financial services sector on the basis that we are all down in these small countries crooks. Similarly, the European Union takes a similar position. We have argued in the United Nations, and the Prime Minister latterly repeated it in his last address to the UN, that there needs to be a global standard on this, and these things ought to be handled through the United Nations at a global level and not through these agencies like OECD or the EU. We're getting some way there because there was a vote taken recently which in the United Nations which says that we're now going to start working on this global standard. So to answer your question, there is a double standard which is being employed against countries like the Bahamas versus the United States. And we have to fight to combat this. The financial services sector created a great deal of wealth for our country. People developed a middle class in and around the banking sector. The morality which these people in Europe keep talking about, what they used to call competition, tax competition. In other words, we're a low tax jurisdiction. They've now turned this into some immoral form, shape or form. But the greater immorality, as far as I'm concerned, is denying people in the Bahamas an adequate income by using the rules of the world for competition. And of course, they have the greater levers of power and are exercising that power. But I've said, as a spokesperson for the Bahamas, that we have a voice. We also know that Pope John Paul said that we have a right as a culture to exist intrinsically. We don't have to give any reasons why we exist. And since we have that voice, and since we have that right to exist, my view is, if you have a voice, you use your voice. Even if it shakes, use your voice. And that's what we intend to do.
It's smart. Cancer pushes us. We push back, challenging conventional thinking, finding smarter solutions, like advanced genomic testing, a diagnostic tool that lets us see cancer at the molecular level, then helps us find different ways to attack it. That's what makes CTCA one of the leaders in precision cancer treatment. We're not just fighting cancer, we're outsmarting it. Visit our website to learn more about advanced genomic testing.
Welcome back to Beyond the Headlines, brought to you by Alive. Well, we continue with our conversation with Foreign Affairs Minister Fred Mitchell. He's also the minister responsible for extraditions. A lot has already come out of the congressional hearing underway in Delaware. Described as the greatest Ponzi scheme in the history of Ponzi schemes, FTX new CEO John Ray has told the Delaware hearing that he does not trust the Bahamian government. Mitchell has been working to avoid the harsh talk from escalating and insists where there is wrong proven to have taken place, those involved will be held to account. Here's how that conversation went. The congressional hearing is being told so far that this is the greatest Ponzi scheme in the history of Ponzi schemes, in the history of the world. And so that is why also, I guess, they're insisting for the Bahamas to sort of stand down and just hand over SBF. People have reported losing their savings, their homes. There's been claims that people have took their lives etc. And it all seems to be, if you listen to that hearing, as we talked before, if you listen to that hearing and a few reports here and there, major respected news outlets, that they're laying all of that at the feet of the Bahamas. You have been leading this crusade single-handedly, fighting on the world stage through media to say, hold up, this is unfair, this is something that the Bahamas will not take on and accept. Where does that crusade go from here? When it's going to maybe get stronger as that hearing continues?
I think we have to, again, make the appeal directly to the U.S. authorities to calm this down and to cut this rhetoric out. I said earlier that I want U.S. legislators to appreciate where they sit in the world, at the apex of the most powerful country in the world. So their words matter. And so their words ought to reflect the facts, not conjecture. That's the first thing. So we'll be working to see what we can do there. And as I said, we have our voice, and we'll try to shape the debate with our voice. So as this develops, you can ask yourself questions like this. Who was it that called him the next Warren Buffett? Who was it that put him on the front page of Forbes magazine? It wasn't the Tribune, it wasn't the Guardian that said he was this genius that made all this money. Those were U.S. agencies or U.S. entities, and people lauded him for his so-called brilliance and success. So how does the Bahamas get in that? I mean, so I'm saying if we want to be pointing fingers, you can keep doing that all the time. It doesn't get to the issue, which is how do you resolve the problem of loss? The fact is there are alleged to have been substantial losses. And as I said, my wealthy friend in the States, I mean, you know, says to me again, I don't understand it. I don't understand cryptocurrency. You know, I don't understand it. I'm not putting my money in it because I don't understand it. It actually is nothing. It appears to be nothing. And so what I put my money in, he says, is car, land, in the bank, treasuries, bonds. Those are in my hand, not stuff that evaporates overnight. So there is a saying, caveat emptor, which is the buyer beware. You go into this thing knowing that it is possible for you, whether in the stock market or in this cryptocurrency market, to lose your money. Now, you're not supposed to be deceived by someone who's dishonest, but it happens. You have a history of this, of snake oil salesmen. The whole expression comes from the United States. Snake oil salesman going around saying this oil is going to heal you, and people buy it, knowing that, you know, if it sounds too good to be true, it must not be true. You know, you have to go into things judiciously. So the laws have to be applied. I say stop the finger pointing and wagging. The jurisdictions have to cooperate, and let's see if we can resolve this problem in the best interest, in the public interest certainly, and in the interest of those people who have lost money.
I'm sure your defense of the country is also fueled by, yes, he made investments here. We understand now that reportedly it was with other people's money unlawfully, but he made investments here. But he also made huge investments in the United States, purchasing naming rights for stadiums and various other types of investments, specifically and more particularly in the sporting arena, where I guess he really wanted a presence. How do they defend that when the Bahamas, like you say, a small island nation in their eyes, is also seeking to empower its residents and welcome in a new investment?
Well, look, we did nothing different from, as I understand their system, congresspersons, senators. What do they want? They want jobs in their district. So the new thing comes along. It's a great investment. You say huge amounts of money are going to be put into this investment. And so you welcome the investment. The United States government itself prides itself in its reports every year as saying this country is business friendly or that country is business friendly. They like the idea that U.S. business persons can come into a country and invest, and the investment is protected. If we had done the opposite and made it difficult for this investment to take place, what do you think they'd be saying? Oh, the Bahamas is such a bad place to invest. You can't get your money, all sorts of things. So in a situation as you're damned you do, damned if you don't. And all I'm saying is, a business investment took place. Yes, the numbers may have been large, but the fact is, just see this as a business failure. The law will step in, both on the civil and on the criminal side, to resolve the problem in favor of those who need to be punished ought to be punished, and those who require compensation, to the extent that it can be clawed back, it will be clawed back, and the jurisdictions ought to cooperate to ensure that that happens.
Minister, you mentioned that the Prime Minister is not at all deterred, discouraged in continuing to pursue even perhaps another opportunity similar to this or like it, and other opportunities that will continue to emerge. Is it time, as a local businessman suggested, that we also perhaps add on to our financial services laws a whistleblower act?
We have to look at all matters of reform, and if whistleblower will help, that's fine. But it doesn't seem to me that whistleblower prevented any of these things. When you look at the timelines, it's clear that the authorities acted with dispatch as soon as they were made aware that there was a problem. So I think we have whistleblower in some of our other legislation now, so it's not a new thing for us. But as I say, the reformers will be looking at all of these laws and regulations and dealing appropriately as it goes forward to make sure the rules are tightened up, regulations are changed to the extent that they need to be.
Many people are wondering about extradition proceedings. That's come up a long time. We've been unable to find attorneys who are free and available to speak to it. You were the minister responsible for as well foreign affairs as well as extradition proceedings in the Bahamas. What is the process of extradition?
Well, I can't comment obviously on this particular matter, but when there are offenses committed by, say, in another country, and that country has identified who has committed those offenses, we have treaties between ourselves and other countries. So we have a treaty with the United States, and it lays out the terms and conditions under which the United States, when it identifies an offender and they have charged that offender, they can ask for that person to be removed from the Bahamas and returned to their jurisdiction. So that's what extradition is about. Extradition is a quasi-judicial decision. The minister has the ability, once it has gone through the courts, because you have to have, first there's I think something called a provisional warrant. That is, you can say, the state who is requesting it can say, look, we have a suspect in our lands. Here's the preliminary evidence. Can you please hold him until we get the evidence? And then the evidence can be presented, and it goes before a court. The court then determines whether the person should be extradited or not. It can be a long procedure, short procedure. The person has a right to fight, or the person can surrender, say, I go back. So that's how that works. And of course, even after the courts have determined extradition, there's also what I call the kind of human rights section, where the minister can refuse the extradition if it is believed that the person may not get a fair trial or will suffer some human rights abuse in the other jurisdiction. So that's generally the framework of the law, and it usually goes through a magistrate's court.
Has the Bahamas ever used that provision and power to say, you know what, I'm sorry, USA or whichever country, we're going to deny this?
Not in my experience. I've been minister. This is the third time. Not in my experience, but there have been cases in the past where the magistrates have refused to extradite citizens to other countries.
Yes. Another thing that came up, we've been watching very closely the U.S. and Russia and their prison exchange. I guess that's an extradition. Can the Bahamas then? Many people have said, hey, listen, give us 90. Since you want Sam Bankman-Fried, can we have this kind of exchange? Is that something the Bahamas participates in as well with the United States?
No. That hasn't come up. What took place between the United States and Russia was those are political acts done at the executive level. So there's nothing that came up with regard to that in my experience in the Bahamas. There are rules, of course, with other countries, Cuba, United States, where people who are in prison in those countries can, after serving a certain portion of their sentence, be repatriated to their home country to serve out the rest of their sentence. And we are in the process of negotiating with the Cubans, for example, on a number of Bahamians who are in their prisons. But the question of political exchanges at that level, no, there's nothing of that nature that has come up. No.
I want to ask if an extradition is affected at all, for example, and I know you don't want to speak specifically to the case at hand, but maybe just generally, there is a group of Americans who Sunday filed some motion with the police where they intend, I understand, on taking it even further, perhaps with a lawsuit. Would that at all hinder, delay the extradition, an extradition at all?
I'm not aware of it. I can't speak to it. The matter is before the courts here, and that's as much as I know in the public domain.
Two cousins, two partners, a boy and a girl, created for themselves their own little world. The best friends now live on separate islands far away, and they are grown with children of their own. But this year's Christmas brought a surprise. The cousins reunited on Christmas Day, and it was decided that everyone would go Russian Junkaloo on Bay. Experience the magic of the road to Bay this holiday season. We are alive.
Hey baby, you back?
Man, it's so good to be home. All I do was eat, shop, and party.
Well, I know you left all of your money over there. I hope you left COVID there too. Anyway, you could get your COVID test for free.
COVID test for what?
Yes, there is rapid antigen COVID tests for anyone who travel who wants to get one.
Well, ain't nothing wrong with me. I ain't sick. What I need a COVID test for?
You don't have to have symptoms. We just want to be sure that the only thing you brought back with you is what is inside that suitcase.
You say it free?
You do not even have to make an appointment. And guess what? You have your results back within 15 minutes.
Wait, you say it quick, convenient, and it free? Thanks. Let me go find one of these testing sites.
Message is brought to you by PAHO WHO and the Ministry of Health and Wellness.
Welcome back to Beyond the Headlines and our 1-hour special conversation with Foreign Affairs Minister Fred Mitchell on the FTX collapse and its impact on the Bahamas. Now, there have been reports of the 1,500 Bahamian accounts that have accessed some $100 million from FTX after it was supposedly frozen, and the process, if any, to get those persons access to their monies. Well, Mitchell addressed that and also talked about the government's goal to financially empower as many Bahamians as possible moving forward. He also talked about what the goal is for 50, that is the 50th independence of anniversary for the country. Turn our focus on the reports of the 1,500 Bahamians who who themselves have invested in FTX, and of course there's been talk about a certain amount of monies that may have been accessed and taken out. However, though, what is the process, if you can speak to it, that those Bahamians would have in restoring and being able to access their investments, if at all, or would they have to wait on Delaware?
I don't know. I've only heard of this in the public domain again. But again, what I said earlier in the interview is that you have to take all these public, pronouncements about who got what and who didn't get what. At this point, you have to be careful how you accept that as the truth. I indicated that what it appears is that the hat is being hung on some email which is alleged to have been sent to one of our public officials. My advice is that when you see the timelines, 2 and 2 simply don't add up to 5, they actually add up to 4. And so I would say let the facts come out before we go down the road of who got what and who didn't get what. I think that's the most judicious thing I can say at this point.
Imagine everybody's saying, what? 1,500 Bahamians, 100 million? Minister, has the Congressional Committee asked at all, made requests to interview any Bahamian authorities or individuals that you know of?
Not that I'm aware of. Not that I'm aware of, no.
Yeah, and as we...
well, certainly not through the foreign ministry, to put it that way.
Yes,
yeah.
As we continue to rebuild, present ourselves as a viable option, as ready and open for business, etc., the message during and following this will be?
Look, this is a great place to do business. It's a well-regulated jurisdiction. There are no intrinsic evils in the Bahamas. The history of relations between the United States and the Bahamas, that history is a good history. And so there is no need to be concerned generally about investing here or coming here. And we continue to sell that message. It's the truth. We don't have to dig into the dirt to do anything, to clean it up or anything. It is a good jurisdiction, well regulated, a good country with good people, and that's our message. And we are friends with the United States, not foes of the United States. This is not a U.S. Commonwealth of the Bahamas fight. Anyone who tries to portray it or picture it as that is mistaken, and it is ill-conceived if that's their view. And I think the temperature on this at all levels should simply be lowered, and let's get to what I say is the nub of the issue. Can we punish those who have alleged to have done misdeeds, and can we get compensation for those who have lost the money? And I would encourage everyone to get proper lawyers and proper advice, not nitwits running around trying to get brownie points, which always prove to be, their assertions always prove to be false. But the idea is for them to get political brownie points and then to move on to something else. Get yourself properly informed. Get yourself lawyered up properly so that you're properly advised about our systems. Our systems, contrary to the arguments that are being advanced in some quarters overseas, are transparent, easy to access, not expensive to access. There are 1,200, 1,500 lawyers in the country. You could find one of them who could properly give you advice on what to do in these circumstances. Again, I'm confident that the jurisdiction is elastic and supple enough to deal with any of these impacts.
And for those in the financial services sector who are nervous, who are watching and have their own fears, what would you say to them?
Well, we have, again, a good country, a good jurisdiction. And so I think you just stand firm and stand fast. The government's going to do its best to promote the jurisdiction, to make sure there's business here. Prime Minister is always in touch with the financial services sector, so is our Attorney General. When they meet, they try to respond to all of the concerns, to try and promote the sector adequately. And so I think that things in the medium term and long term, despite these little dislocations, Bahamas has an interesting history. How we get on the front pages of other people's newspapers. It always happens in these cycles, from the murder of Harry Oakes in 1943, the whole thing about the UBP and their connection with the mafia and gambling in the country. This happens, but look, we've survived it, and the system has proven supple and elastic enough to bounce back from any of the assaults which come at it. And I'm confident we have certainly at the helm the best educated generation that the country's produced, and we'll do our best to maintain it, to make sure that these 27 young people that we talked about in London will want to continue to be associated with the Bahamas and come back home. Reputation is everything, and we intend to maintain the reputation of the country. I'm a strong believer in the place. It's I sometimes one of my favorite spots in the country is Grand Bahama, of course, and I walk around that place, and it's highly developed. It's a city for 250,000 people with all the roads and all the infrastructure. Can't understand why it can't get up off the ground, because you're actually living in a paradise. And I think that that's a message which we ought to take everywhere we go as Bahamians. This is a place we ought to be proud to be in. And it's a project, however, that you have to continue to work on. When you became an independent country, it was a jurisdictional decision in some place. It doesn't mean that all the problems got solved. What it meant was, and what it means is, that you have the right to make decisions for yourselves. So that's what we're doing. We're making decisions for ourselves. There's an opposition, there's a government, it's a healthy democracy. And by the way, when we have elections here, what happens? We say, okay, you beat me, I go home, I fight you for the next one. We don't have any insurrections in the street with people, jumping into the House of Assembly trying to, oust the speaker and all of that. We have a history of a grand democracy. So we ought to be proud of all of those things and never let anybody say things about this country or jump on the bandwagon with people who are saying things about this country, because that's the next thing. What I find, for example, in some of these WhatsApp groups that I'm put in, how you have this dialogue where people are actually jumping on the bandwagon, hopping on this bandwagon, attacking their own country. It's just incredible to me, but that's the way it is. So we have to disabuse this notion that there's anything intrinsically wrong with the Bahamas. They're bad actors. You try and weed them out, but the country itself is a good country.
As we are on the road to 50, whether it's the financial services industry or any other industry, the Bahamian people at large, what do you want to see take shape, or even moving on from this point as we celebrate 50 years of independence and beyond?
Well, independence was the project of my generation and Sir Lyndon's generation. Andrew Dud Maynard's just died, so condolences to his family, but it marks the end of an era. The people who are now in their 80s and 90s are passing on. So my generation, those of us who are in our 60s and 70s, are the ones who are actually the protectors of the legacy, so to speak. And so I met Lyndon Pindling in '69, and his generation left us this charge, which is the question of economic empowerment. And economic empowerment means growing the pie and making sure that Bahamians at large have economic wealth, the economic wealth of this country. Now, what happened in the time of my opponents, political opponents, is that they, sad to say, and in our view, concentrated the power in the economic power and wealth in those who already had it. We made some fundamental and controversial decisions when we were in office the last time. One of them was the gambling sector, which the consequence of that decision was to transfer significant wealth to people who had never had it before. That's the mission of the Progressive Liberal Party, to transfer wealth to people who had never had it before, so that we have a more equitable distribution of wealth in the country, that those 27 people who are in London say they don't want to come back will think, look, this is a place I can raise my family, I can invest my money, because this is a place which is growing and dynamic. So that's the project for year 50 for us and beyond. In my view, we've been too deliberative. I sometimes call it dithering in trying to make some of the hard decisions because we're afraid that we're going to get public criticism for it. My view is damn the torpedoes. We have to move ahead, because if we don't, time is going. And if we're fighting very hard to break the curse of the one term, so we're fighting to see if we can get the Bahamian people to agree on a second term, to actually concretize this project of economic empowerment and spreading the wealth around. So you'll find me in my public pronouncements, and certainly in my private pronouncements, I'm pushing my colleagues all the time. Time's going, tick tock, tick tock. We gotta make the decisions, and damn the torpedoes. We've gotta move ahead on this, because we cannot leave office and not have said to ourselves we've done everything possible to create wealth for people who don't have the wealth today. The central bank did a study, I think it was 2018, just before the pandemic. Shocking, the level of poverty in the country. It said families making $30,000 a year or less in this country, 50% of them reported that they could not make ends meet at the end of the month. That is shocking. This country is a wealthy country, and we must find a more equitable distribution, give people a living wage. The curmudgeons of the business community say, oh, it's going to be this and that. We know that when you put money in the hands of those in the lowest socioeconomic rungs, that money helps drive the economy. The rich people, they say, you give them a benefit, they say that drives the economy, this trickle down. We know that that's nonsense. We know that what actually drives the economy is when money is in the hands of working people, because they spend the money, they drive the economy. So that's our mission. Economics and economic empowerment, and we're going to do everything we can. Certainly from a personal point of view, I'll be pushing that as a message going forward.
Mr. Mitchell, the country loves to hear that message and to know that that is a mandate at year 50 and moving forward, because particularly in this inflationary times and that kind of thing, and to hear people even hint of recession, they really welcome that message, and to see that there's action behind that message. Yeah, there has to be, and we just have to do it. And as I said, this the most educated generation the country has had, right? And I tell all of them, people come all the time and they say, well, if I step forward, am I going to be victimized? And I said, well, Clifford Darling came from Chester's Acklands with a 8th grade education. I think he left when he was at school when he was 14 or something like this. And what gave them the courage, these people the courage to come to town, think that they could actually bring down the government? And they did it. So you have university education, and he had an 8th grade education. So what are you afraid of? There are consequences, because for every action there's an equal and opposite reaction. But life is about fighting and fighting and fighting and never giving up. Churchill said it, never give up, never give up. And that's my view.
Eyewitness News and Beyond the Headlines will continue to follow this SBF and FTX case. You certainly can continue to tune in to us, your number one source for this entire story as it develops and reaches its conclusion. We thank you so much for joining us this evening here on the show. We certainly appreciated you joining us. For the entire Beyond the Headlines team, I'm Shanique Miller. Make it a great evening, everyone.
The Verizon Media Group. home of ILTV, Paramount Systems Limited, Eyewitness News, and Beyond the Headlines.